Welcome to Psychology Ninjas. Today we're tackling individual differences in obedience, talking specifically about personality and gender. When we're using the phrase individual differences, we're basically saying the reason why the results are different is that the people are different, which isn't very psychological. But we can also talk about this in terms of participant variables in research methods, and again, that differences in the participants is creating a different outcome. Okay, so how are we going to talk about this in relation to obedience and personality and gender? Well, when we're explaining this, we're thinking about individual differences as a theory, that rather than it being agency theory or social impact theory, that actually it's factors about these individuals, their disposition, that is creating obedience. And therefore, we need to talk about the key terms associated with it. For personality, we're identifying those different personality types, and we're talking specifically about why obedience is the consequence of this personality type. For authoritarian personality, we want to focus in on authoritarian submission, that these people are submitting to an authority figure without question and therefore are more likely to obey. We could also talk about this in relation to authoritarian aggression, that actually when their authority is challenged, they are very aggressive to the subordinate, and therefore they're expecting that response from them that they are obedient. And this is seen in Milgram's research, that where the participant was not obedient and they weren't learning those words correctly, they were aggressive to them in terms of delivering the electric shocks. We also want to talk about locus of control and Rotter's ideas and how these link into obedience, with an internal locus of control being less obedient or more likely to dissent because they're remaining in that autonomous state where they feel responsible for their behaviour. The reverse is true for external locus of control, and again explaining that in terms of the likelihood of obedience. Our other individual difference then is gender, and we want to be focusing on Gilligan's moral reasonings. We have two different ones that we want to talk about, the ethic of justice and the ethic of care. And again, it's important that you explain why this results in destructive obedience. Also within gender, we're going to explain some research and give a conclusion in relation to gender. I would talk about how men are more obedient, but you can do a different piece of research and substitute this out when we come to our evaluation. I'm going to talk about Kilhan and Mann's research, who replicated Milgram's baseline, and I'm going to give specific findings to show my detailed psychological knowledge. Okay, so our other skill in relation to this is how we evaluate, and we've identified that this is a theory, and so we're going to use SODA to evaluate. So this is what it looks like, and we need to make sure that we're giving logical chains of reasoning with arguments and counter-arguments. So in terms of our personality then, what we want to be talking about is Elms and Milgram's research, which supported the F scale and that participants were more obedient on that questionnaire. We're going to say that personality lacks validity because we've got other evidence that says that personality is not having an impact. Okay, what we need to be really careful of in this in terms of different theories is that we're making sure that we explain that different theory, but also why that is better than personality and gender. When we're talking about situational factors, it's important that we're saying that anyone can be obedient and that that is less socially sensitive. Okay, so how are we going to put this together in terms of an 8 marker? Well, we're going to explain locus of control, and then we're going to talk about those pieces of research, having that link, that mini conclusion. We're then going to move through and talk about Kilhan and Mann's research and our conclusion that men are more obedient, but we're going to say this lacks reliability and is inconsistent externally because we've got different research with different findings. As I said, what you might want to do here is substitute Sheridan and King for Kilhan and Mann and just change the emphasis of your response. What we're going to counter that with is either Berger's research that says that there were no significant differences, and that's one of the contemporary studies in social psychology, or alternatively you could use Blass's research here. Then we're going to talk about moral reasoning, talking about both the ethic of care and justice, but we're going to say that this is an incomplete explanation, giving an alternative factor. Finally, we're going to talk about authoritarian personality and how that applies to human resources and the allocation of people within job roles. We're also going to bring in gender here, and when we're talking about the socialisation of children, we're saying how we bring them up. If we can apply things to the real world, it adds credibility to our explanation. Okay, here we've got a slightly different question. Explain one strength and one weakness of personality as a factor in obedience. So we know we're just focusing on personality. So our research support, our external reliability is going to be our justification, and we're going to explain that through Elms and Milgram's research. Our weakness here is still going to sit in this same row, and here we're going to say that actually this explanation lacks validity because it does not predict disobedience, and that's because we're just focusing on personality. Okay, let's have a look at some other exam questions. So here we've got a scenario-based question, and when we're thinking about any exam question, we want to focus in on what is the command word. Here it is discuss. When we have a discuss question, we're not being asked to evaluate. We're being asked to explain and apply that explanation to our given scenario. So what are we explaining? Well, we know we need to explain individual differences, and our scenario is why the children differ in their obedience. So we've got to think about, we've got some children in a primary school, so it's important that we're giving examples that are appropriate for that audience. Okay, so how does this break down? Well, what we're wanting to do is still illustrate our knowledge, so we're going to explain authoritarian personality, giving all those lovely details and key terminology within that in terms of conventionalism, authoritarian aggression and authoritarian submission that we've already talked about as part of this video. Then we're going to give some application through examples. We need to give lots of different examples here because we need lots of different application to thoroughly demonstrate our knowledge. Here we've talked about Mr. Lowe might have want to have parental meetings to decide whether they're harsh or critical parents in their style. He might want to ask the children some questions about their routines, again to determine whether they have harsh critical parents. Okay, we might also want to assess their level of conventionalism, okay, whether they subscribe to traditional norms and values, and here I've given one in terms of same-sex marriage, but you could talk about gender roles and traditional gender roles here. What we're going to do is move through this, giving different examples for each of our different key terminology, addressing both personality and gender. Here's a different exam question. Again, we want to be thinking about our command word, and here we have the command word assess, which means we need to explain and evaluate. Here we're talking about developmental psychology, and this is a funny one when it comes to obedience. What we're saying here is that people have developed over time, that they have changed how they are acting, or that their childhood is influencing their adult behaviour. How they have been brought up, how they have developed is explaining obedience. Well, this is personality and it's gender. What we would want to do is make a few tweaks in terms of our explanation to make sure that we're absolutely cueing the examiner into the fact that we have acknowledged that this is developmental psychology. Okay, so we're talking about locus of control, we've given our explanation of internal and external, and then we're saying that these traits have developed as a response to situations that have occurred and have been nurtured over the course of our lives. The same thing in terms of moral reasoning. What we want to say is that it's encouraged in males, and give some examples of socialisation, of child rearing practices, of how men are brought up or how boys are brought up, and why that would encourage those values. The same thing in terms of girls and females, and why they're encouraged and how they're encouraged, maybe in terms of toys or activities, to have this ethic of care. Authoritarian personality, it's critical here that we highlight harsh and critical parents. Thanks for joining us today at Psychology Ninjas, and I hope that helps you through individual differences. Please feel free to like our channel, Don't forget to subscribe so you're getting up-to-date videos on new content that's coming out. Thanks for your support. See you again soon.